October 21st, 2016, and I'm in the home of Mike Ewens in Ventura, California, talking with him about his 31-year career in the United States Army. I am Terry DeMay, and I will be interviewing Mike on behalf of the National Societies both of the Daughters of the American Revolution, Conejo Valley Chapter, and the Colonial Dames 17th Century Aquila Chase Chapter. Ed Lynch of Advanta Videography will be filming the interview. Mike was born on March 13, 1939 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He served in the United States Army from February 1963 to February 1994. He attended Marquette University's ROTC program and graduated with a degree in political science. Mike was commissioned on February 1, 1963, launching his active duty Army life shortly after graduation. Although retired, Mike continues to serve military veterans by supporting the annual Ventura County Stand Down for Homeless Veterans and is a 60-year volunteer with the Red Cross. This is Mike's story. Mike, where were you born?
Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and most of my life in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I grew up in a house on Sarno Street, which is named after my great-great-grandfather, Christian Sarno, who was a first lieutenant in the 26th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment. He served in the Civil War, and land was given to him as part of I think it's like a bounty following the war as a benefit. And so I grew up in the house there with my grandmother, who was born in 1880 and is a daughter of this great-grandfather. She was very much a part of his storytelling of the Civil War, etc., and so I became very much involved with military type things at that time, and I think that was kind of a start of my interest in the military. And then there's another great-grandfather, Anton Evans, a sergeant in the same unit in the Civil War, and he was actually captured at Andersonville, then transferred to a hospital in Alexandria, Virginia, where he had been wounded, and so he was kept as a prisoner there. Anyway, so Milwaukee, Wisconsin was my, founding grounds. I went to a college prep, Marquette University High School, and then I went to Marquette University, and I enrolled in ROTC. I thought that was appropriate since my great-grandfathers, and all the Civil War type stuff. And then my father never served in the military. He built a landing craft during World War II, but all of my uncles did, and most of the older cousins and that type thing served in the World War II. And so in Milwaukee, I graduated with a bachelor's degree from Marquette University. I would later return for a master's. And at that point, I was commissioned the 1st of February, 1963, as a second lieutenant. And at that time, it was the Air Defense Artillery course. I went on active duty in March of 1963, left Milwaukee and at Fort Bliss, Texas, and did the Air Defense Officer course, and then which was Nike Hercules missiles, and then following that I did 2 weeks at Fort Sill, which was to give me an indoctrination to field artillery so that I understood the difference between firing rockets and this firing the normal howitzers and field pieces. And at that time, it was interesting. At that time, I was supposed to be assigned to a nuclear warhead unit in Italy. Well, the Italian elections that year, the communists took over in 1963, so the Army suddenly changed everything and said, no, you're going to go to a regular firing battery in Germany. I got married to my first wife, Gail, on May 31st, and on the 2nd of June, I was at the Brooklyn Army Terminal in New York, preparing to board a troop ship, the USNS Upshur. This ship was used, of course, World War II and Korea. It was to be the last movement of troops to Germany. After that, of course, all the aircraft, people fly all the time, you know, kind of thing. And we left the harbor. I'll never forget that. I was appointed, as a young second lieutenant, they give you any job they can think of. You know, oh, I wanted to do this. And so I was the duty officer twice, and we had approximately 1,000 young men in the ship, in the hold down below, and they were in 8 bunks tiered up like this. And we hit a hurricane, and so you can imagine the poor young kids scared stiff and throwing up and so forth. So it was quite an adventure crossing to Bremerhaven, Germany. At that time, anyway, we made it safely, all of us. At that point, I took a troop train down to Frankfurt and then was picked up by an officer from the 4th of the 6th Missile Battalion, which was based in Bitburg, Germany. And I reported to Charlie Battery. I became a missile launch officer. I was part of the 32nd Air Defense Brigade, which was responsible for protecting all of Europe. We were the ones who were to protect both against aircraft coming in, and then nothing classified about it, but the Army Times used to report there were about 7,000 nuclear weapons that the U.S. had in Germany at that time, and a lot of these missiles were, you know, equipped to fight with nuclear weapons. I used to wonder what would have happened if that had ever been turned loose, the Holocaust that would have been. But anyway, so I served there in the battery, doing training exercises, and the U.S. would mimic MiGs attacking, or they would mimic or role model the Russians coming through the Fulda Gap towards us, and as a result you would then fire these weapons of mass destruction kind of thing, etc. And then the other thing is you used to, once a month we had alerts, and then once a month we had practiced for attacks all the time, and so you were constantly on edge, sort of thing. And then my wife at that time used to get scared about it because they practiced the non-essential evacuation orders, in which people who weren't part of the military were to flee, get in your car and flee to the French coast, kind of thing, which is a very scary proposition when you think we had over 300,000 troops at that time in Germany and France, etc. So, but anyway, and during that time, which is kind of important to note, is as we know, in November of 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated, and all of Germany went on alert. We manned machine gun posts in front of our headquarters, in front of the firing batteries, just everywhere. The Germans, everybody went crazy because they thought this was to be the attack of the Russians across the Fulda Gap, which is historic, by the way. That's how Germany was invaded a number of times. And as a result, of course, thank God nothing happened. But it was kind of an interesting point where you're so far from home and your president's killed. So anyway, we got through that point. And then during that time, the military installed, it's a bunker underground, kind of like Cheyenne Mountain. It's right near Birkenfeld. And it was a missile control center called 412L. It was in, actually, funny thing, it was in the papers even in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was both Air Force controlling fighter aircraft, and then guys like me, and or gals even at that time, controlling missile sites. And we would practice, you know, against U.S. and British and French aircraft. And then occasionally, it was quite interesting, the Russians used to think it was fun to taunt us, and would run MiG-15s and I think they're MiG-17s against the border. They'd come at a high rate of speed towards the border, and then suddenly they'd flare up because knowing if they cross the border, that looks like a war to start, kind of thing. And so it was a very, very interesting assignment, because you got to really see the war plans being put into place. How are we going to respond if the Russians attack us? And during that time, also because of my security clearance, I could not go to Berlin. We had the wall was up, of course. I could not go to Berlin by train, by car, etc., because I was considered a catch, because I knew too much. I mean, now that all that information I had is a moot point. But so anyway, my wife and I flew to Berlin, landed at Tempelhof, and then toured Berlin, and then went to Checkpoint Charlie. She could cross into East Germany, but I could not. And it was made pretty apparent to me why we were there when we would watch I stood on that platform at Checkpoint Charlie next to a German family, and they would raise different colored rolls of paper, like wrapping paper for Christmas or something. And it was a signal, and suddenly across, way off, the road split, and you could see apartment buildings way back in East Berlin, and suddenly somebody would step out. They'd hold up, I think it was green or orange, I can't remember now, and wave it that they knew their family was all right, and they'd duck out of the way. So they wouldn't get shot, etc., because the Volkspolizei, which guarded the borders, were very trigger happy. We heard a couple of times machine gun fire, and later found out a person trying to cross was killed. But anyway, so I served in Germany until June of 1966. It was a very satisfying experience. I was able to travel, was able to experience all the parts of Germany, Europe, crossed to North Africa. And there was my first touch of when you're caught in an uprising. We were in Morocco during a student uprising, and that night, the night was broken by the sound of constant 50 caliber machine gun fire and tracers in the night. And I didn't think we were even going to get out of there alive, but the next morning the Moroccan army was lining the streets, and so they got all the Americans across the Straits of Gibraltar again. I thought, thank God. But anyway, June of '66, left Germany. So that's technically what I would call my first war, and that's the National Defense Service Medal is given for that period of time because that was the Cold War, and we faced actually nuclear annihilation. Then the second war was I was assigned to Vietnam and joined the 1st Cavalry Division, 1st Air Cav. This was they'd crossed over in '66 or '67. I'm the second team, as they called it, I was actually assigned to an artillery battalion, field artillery, 8-inch 175 millimeter guns, and it was 3rd of the 18th. Basically what I did was ended up serving as the S5, which is the civil affairs, which means working with the local population in attempting to improve their lives, attempt to work on their infrastructures, health programs. God, MedCap, I delivered 2 babies over there, Vietnamese women, and did take part in a number of patrols, etc. Then they kind of what would the word be, assign me to MACV team, military advisory team 220, and about January of '67. Did a lot of work with them. Most of it, yes, there was infantry stuff, firefights, mortar attacks, recoilless rifle attacks, etc. But I would say that most of my work was done in an advisory role and working on what would the word be, a more pleasant level than the act of, having to engage in killing a bunch of people. Actually the fighting part is why I ended up getting a combat infantryman's badge. I guess if you're shot at enough, they give you a medal for it. So anyway, and then We did everything from built bridges across streams that they couldn't cross during rainy seasons, because of course Vietnam is in the monsoon pattern, and horrific storms. I mean, my God, the roads turned to seas of mud, and you couldn't even get trucks through them. You couldn't even walk through this stuff. But anyway, so I was served with them, as I said, until April of '67. For some reason, they started doing some early releases, and so I and a bunch of other guys were then turned or were released from active duty from Vietnam. It was April of '67, and came back to the States. My wife at that time was not happy with the military, and so that was the reason I kind of left. Although I said I still want to stay, and so while in Milwaukee.
And that was Gail Helen Brand?
Right, yes.
Okay, your second wife?
Second.
Thank you.
First wife. Gail is my first
Oh,
wife.
I'm sorry.
And anyway, and so I had left active duty, and then I went back to school and picked up a master's degree at Marquette University. Helped and at the same time worked as an assistant dean of students there. So I was involved at that period as the uprisings of student uprisings, etc. So I got to see problems in my own world, back in the U.S. Anyway, in '69, I was accepted to the Claremont Graduate School out here in Claremont, California, for doctoral studies in public administration and kind of a side field of Asian studies kind of thing. I had talked to some people in the military, and they said that would be good for strategic intelligence and so forth if I come back on active duty. And so 1969 through 1977, I served as a member of the 426th Civil Affairs Battalion. At that time it was in Upland, California. I was the operations officer, S3, and then I was the XO. Took part in a number of operations. Went back to Fort Bragg for Exotic Dancer, in which we worked with the 82nd Airborne, 1st Marine Division, etc., and these huge things in the swamps of North Carolina, which interestingly enough is where my youngest son is now stationed at Fort Bragg. So. Anyway, and so a lot of opportunities there, and then, as I said, I'm in California, and then in '77 to '79, I became an operations officer for the CA Civil Affairs Group in Los Angeles. Again, took part in a number of planning things. All of these units at that time had very distinct tasks as part of 18th Corps and 1st Corps, etc., and it was to deal with Asia. And so a lot of times we had what they call summer camp, or the 2 weeks active duty, would be spent at a university going over lots of data on a foreign nation. It might be the Philippines, it might be Indonesia, it could be Korea, it could be, you name it, it could be any place. Anyway, and then in 1979, Major General Dan Helix approached me and said, we'd like you to take command of the 425th Civil Affairs Battalion in Santa Barbara. By that time, I had moved up here. I had taken a civilian job with the county. And so in 1979 through 1983, I became the commanding officer of the 425th Civil Affairs Battalion. Again, a lot of it was... we did a lot of training, studies kind of things on other nations, particularly in Southeast Asia. And then at that time, a lot of exercises. It's gone now. The 7th Infantry Division was based at Fort Ord, the Bayonet Division, and we took part in huge operations up at Hunter Liggett and across all those areas, Camp San Luis Obispo, etc., and in which we had, with the Marines, the 7th Infantry Division, and my people, the unit did civil affairs work with role players, etc., and then they, and in fact, in trying to protect part of it was role-playing, protecting these people so that there wasn't abuse by American troops, and, you know, to make certain that American troops knew how to correctly deal with indigenous populations, etc. And that lasted till 1983. And at that time, I went to the divisional headquarters, 63rd, which was a reserve unit in Los Alamitos. I went as an assistant operations officer. And then in 1984, I was asked to take command of the 622nd 6222 United States Armed Forces School in Pasadena. We did all the training. We had both Army, National Guard, Army Reserve, and we also put on training for NCOs from other type of services. We even had Navy folks, did training down here at Hueneme. Did training for Air Force folks, even had some Marines involved. Most of it was Army, but anyway, that lasted till 1987. It was a very unique experience, particularly since you could see that the training that hopefully you would provide would assist these individuals, male and female, both officer and enlisted, in the performance of their duties. And it's kind of interesting because what I didn't realize that the last exercise we did in '87 was a huge transportation exercise up at Fort Hunter Liggett, in which we had helicopters attacking, IEDs, the explosive devices, etc. And none of us knew this, but that was '87. 4 years later, all these people, these transportation units that we were going through this mock war with, would end up serving in Desert Storm, and because they were the the forward leading edge, because if you didn't haul fuel and ammunition, there's no sense. You can't go to war. You can have all the dang tanks in the world lined up, but they can't go anywhere. So these folks ended up, it was interesting, most of them were still populated by folks that had been through the training, and so they were to go to Desert Storm. And then in 1987, I stepped down as the commander, commandant of the unit, and in fact, that's where I met my current wife, Lydia. She was the adjutant, the administrative officer for the school, etc. Anyway, '87, the step down. The major general, said, "Michael, they're going to do the bicentennial of the Constitution, the 200th anniversary of when we signed the Constitution on September 17th, 1787. And we'd like to see if you're capable of doing the job with us." It was to work with the Secretary of the Army, John Marsh, Reagan administration, etc. And we want you to come back and be interviewed by a lieutenant general who was the aide to the secretary, etc. And so you have to come back, and you have to be comfortable in talking to large audiences and explaining what we're doing. You have to be comfortable in PR stuff. You have to be comfortable in contacting because we orchestrated all this stuff. I mean, each of the academies had to send contingents to this parade that would take place with the president. I ended up addressing Gold Star mothers, etc., which was really a difficult task, sort of thing. And because some of them would come up and say, "Did you know my son?" No, ma'am, I didn't, because I had the Cav patch on, and a lot of their sons had served with the first Cav and had been killed. Anyway, I had an opportunity during that time with the bicentennial. It's a little team. We went to the White House. We briefed Reagan, and then we briefed Dad Bush on what was going to take place with the bicentennial. Was so that because the president was going to make a speech in Philadelphia, and I always laugh when they say, "Did you help write the speech?" I said, "Yes, I recognized one word, the." I said I didn't recognize another word that I wrote. I said, "I'm sorry." But anyway, and then worked with the Secretary of the Army, which was really it's quite fascinating. Then at that time, what they would do is pull us off from that, and then we'd go to assist as assistant briefing officers in Congress, either with the House of Representatives or the Senate. You know, you sit next to a lieutenant general, or one time it was with the Secretary of the Army, and then you hand them some briefing papers. Sir, this is, you know, and then they'd be able to respond to a question maybe they were asked by either a senator or congressman or an aide, kind of thing. And so that was really quite fascinating, and the fact that I got to brief Reagan was kind of neat. But anyway, so that finally came to an end, December of 1987. And after that, they said, well, listen, Colonel Evans, you did so well, we'd like you to come on active duty every so often. We're going to make you a mobilization designee to work with the Deputy Chief of Staff for operations for the U.S. Army. That's where all the war planning goes on. And they wanted me to take part in what's called force structure. Now, force structure says to man, and down to the simplest thing, it goes down to, for instance, a helicopter. How many people need to be in the helicopter? How many people need to be in a Bradley fighting vehicle? How many people in an Abrams M1A2 tank, etc.? So we did that, and then it also is magnified up the chain. It's how many people in a division, how many people in a brigade, and so we did all of that kind of analysis over the next period of time until 91, and again I was involved with briefings of Congress, because you know senators go, oh, you're going to cut all these people out. Well, who's going to do the war, you know? And you'd go, well, okay, well, this is how the weapon systems run. This is how the people that'll be in there work on this stuff. So it's quite interesting. And from a guy, I didn't mention it, at Claremont, I had almost finished my doctorate. Actually, had started on the dissertation, but then ran into the violence of the anti-war demonstrations with one of the professors. It was quite interesting. He had his doctorate from Yale. He was married to a Chinese woman who was the daughter of, her father had been a Kuomintang general under Chiang Kai-shek and then switched allegiance to Mao Zedong. So now here this lady he's married to, her father is a principal with the Chinese communists. And believe me, he didn't like the troops. You'd think I was the direct emissary of President Lyndon Johnson, etc. Anyway, so I never finished it. The dean said, Michael, you're going to have to take about another 5 courses. And I finally thought, you know, I've studied out my brain now. I think I don't need this. And what's funny is at this time, well, in fact, sometime before that, in 77, I had applied for a position at Ventura College. I ended up becoming a part-time instructor and adjunct professor of business, and they ended up recognizing all the stuff I had towards a PhD, and I was paid as though I had a PhD because I'd taken 9 million courses and 9 million subjects dealing with public administration and business, etc. So anyway, the days go along, and suddenly it's August of 1990. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Iraq invades Kuwait. And both Lydia and I get messages from the Pentagon asking us to volunteer to come on active duty because we're going to need all the hands on deck that we can get. And Lydia, by the way, was also working as a Mob Des at the Pentagon at the same time. Her job was force structure also, but in feeding people as people would have been killed, you need to find places where you're going to take them from. You're going to take them from Europe, you can take them from Alaska, take them from the United States, take them from Asia, and then flow them to fill the spots being left by casualties. And in fact, at that point, it was, we estimated, and it also showed with what we built with the hospital units. They figured there'd be more thoracic surgeons needed. That's chest wounds hit in the chest by weapons. It said that they figured there would be 4,000 wounded a day and 400 killed in action. Thanks to God, we only had 167 deaths in Desert Storm, but Lydia, with her part of her job, was to flow people, say, from Korea to fill tank positions, etc. Anyway, so we get to the Pentagon late December, beginning January of 90. And of course, at that point, it's called Desert Shield, which is, we're shielding the rest of the world, and we wait and we build. It was really fascinating. I was on the team with an assistant secretary of defense, the assistant secretary of the Army, and all these generals. And the idea was to build the force for Schwarzkopf that he felt was necessary to take on Iraq. And of course, as you know, we built to about 500,000 troops. That's Marines, that's the Army, the Air Force, etc. And it was quite fascinating sitting there with them, these generals and these upper-ranking civilians, about decisions to be made. And what's always interesting to note is all of this always has a political angle, because there were doctors yanked out of their practices. They thought they could just stay in the reserves, but suddenly they're going to a war in a hellacious place. The temperature is 140 degrees. And so we also had lots. One of the things we would end up doing is helping to write letters to the president responding. People complaining, my doctor's been pulled out of town. And you'd write, we're sorry, but he's serving, that kind of thing. So that was quite fascinating to see that too. Anyway, then President Bush was under the gun. He decided, of course, as we know, not to take on Baghdad, which really would have caused, the turmoil that later follows, with the splitting up of Shiites and Sunnis and the rest of this stuff. Anyway, but President Bush was under the gun to withdraw all the personnel and the vehicles. And what people don't realize is we had 110,000 tracked and wheeled vehicles in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. We're talking gazillions of them. I have somewhere around here, I have pictures of them where they're lined up. It just goes across a field flowing with these Abrams tanks and trucks and fuel trucks, etc. Anyway, so we get to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in March of 91, and our job is to facilitate the movement of these back from there to ships in Dahamam. They loaded in, and then they took them back to Europe and brought them back to the States, and they moved. And then the troops, and then you would sit there and watch C-5As loading with, hundreds of troops on board, I was stationed at that time in King Khalid Military City, which is that was the king, the prior king. Saud was the king when we were there. But anyway, and it was a Saudi Arabian army post, so it was quite fascinating because it was very strongly Islamic. Of course, you had the mosques all the time through the post. And you literally, every morning, at the call to prayers, you'd hear the wailing from the top of the mosques, kind of stuff. We said they had to have electronics. How could we hear it that far away? But, of course, the thing is they do it verbally. But anyway, so we're there through May of 91. We begin to extract hundreds and thousands of troops flying back to the United States. And I returned to the Pentagon, and then on June the 9th was Victory Day celebration, and this was particularly poignant for me, because having returned from Vietnam and flown into, I was wearing at that time we had the khaki shorts, the khaki shirt and khaki pants, etc. And I had flown into SeaTac, Seattle-Tacoma Airport, kind of thing, and that was where we were unfortunately welcomed by people spitting on us, yelling at us, baby killers, and blah, blah, blah. It was not a good time.
This is when you came home from Vietnam.
Vietnam, right. And it's the poignancy is the difference between that and June the 9th of 91. I went to the parade. I didn't participate, I just stood alongside. people would come up and shake your hand and, you know, all that other kind of stuff. And people, you know, even on the, what is it, the metro would come up to you, etc., because I was in uniform when I'd gone, came to the parade and came back, etc. You know, they were thanking you for it, which was unlike the welcome we had from Vietnam, so that was quite nice.
This was after Desert Storm.
After Desert Storm, right, June the 9th, and that's when Schwarzkopf and the guys, General Pagonis and all the rest, marched down the mall, you know, and the president was there, etc. So that was quite awesome. I continued to return to the Pentagon. Oh, I was finally discharged. This was also interesting. Both my sons have been with me in assignments at the Pentagon, but this was my youngest son, Matthew, who's now an Army major. He was there with me in August of '91 when they awarded me the Meritorious Service Medal, and the lieutenant general that headed the DESOPS, you know, pinned it on me, etc. And so Matt got to, you know, be a part of all of that stuff. And so Matthew and I then drove home in '91 from the Pentagon back here to Ventura, kind of thing. But I still remained active in force structure. And then in '92, when we became involved with Somalia kind of thing, they recalled me to work. I spent a month and a half at the Pentagon working on both what the force structure in the year 2001 would be, 10 years forward, and then also on the Somalia response. And they actually asked me if I would like to go to Somalia, Mogadishu, and run a operations center and I said, you know, I think I've had my union card punched a few times. I said, I'm going to let a younger person do it. And at that time, of course, as anybody knows anything about Somalia and that part of Africa, the Horn, a lot of diseases. And I just thought, you know, I just don't want to go overseas again. This would be my fourth war. And I said, I think I will pass on that this time and give it to a younger man or woman, whoever wants it. But anyway, so I served until the beginning of '93. Came back to Ventura, took part in a reserve training unit, but then my days were numbered. 1 February of 1994, I had finished 31 years in the Army, both active and reserve, and at that point the Army said, I think it's time for you to retire. Here's another MSM, Meritorious Service Medal, and thank you for your service, and have a good day. And so it was at that point that I stepped back. I might add at this point a little bit about my family. Not only is Lydia an Army colonel herself, one of the few Native American Hispanic women to reach that rank. In fact, in 1987, there were only 260 of them that had ever with that ethnicity. And then both my sons joined. Scotty joined the Air Force. He served, he was in Desert Storm, but he was stateside, but he ended up being in the attacks in Iraq, etc. He was Air Force Pararescue Squadron, and he was called to active duty also. He served in a couple of them, and then his brother, Matt, decided to go Army ROTC, graduated from UC Davis with his degree, and both my sons have served 2 tours in Iraq. Scotty with the Air Force at Balad Air Force Base near Baghdad, and then Matthew was stationed both with the 7th Iraqi Division, as well as he was part of the task force that went into Ramadi in Anbar province, which was the hellhole and killing zone for Americans, just brutal. And they were part of a reinforcement, first of the 35th Armored Battalion kind of thing. He commanded 40 medics, and they needed medics like you wouldn't believe. But anyway, and he's still on active duty. My oldest son, Scotty, retired as a tech sergeant from the U.S. Air Force a number of years ago. He actually works for the Air Force now at Davis-Monthan at what's called the Boneyard, which is where there's 6,000 aircraft on 4,000 acres and, retrofitting and so forth. But anyway, Matthew is currently the comptroller for the medical brigade and part of the hospital at Bragg, which is part of the 18th Airborne Corps, which is our response force. That's the 82nd Airborne, 18th Airborne Corps. Those are the ones the president says the whistle is blowing now. Those are the guys that get on the planes and go to the next war. So, but anyway, yeah, it's the military has been satisfying to me. I do not like war, and I do not like killing. But the problem is war doesn't define that very closely. Whatever happens, happens, and you don't always have an opportunity to say, I don't want to be here. You raise your right hand, sign your name and your life, and okay, I'll go wherever you want me to go. But fortunately, I think with all my assignments, I've been able to be in a position where I've been able to, I think in some cases, I'm not some rough and tough colonel kind of thing yelling at people. I like to work with folks, and I think with the assignments I had, like Vietnam particularly, I liked working with the people. I had no problems like my poor son Matt, who was the advisor with the Iraqis, which we read in the papers about not always trusting the Iraqi forces, etc. And so he always had to watch his backside. I was at least fortunate enough to work with Vietnamese who in civic action projects more than infantry opera. Of course I did that too, but not as much. But anyway, and I felt that I was able to contribute and maybe to save some lives, etc. And what was interesting about Vietnam is there's a couple of times when ambushes were set up for me because these people liked me, and my nickname over there was Dai Wee Rao, which is Captain Mustache, and some of them died, protecting me, so I felt that I'd done a good job for that. So, and even with the assignment, Germany actually was interesting when I worked at not so much the missile, the battalion, but when I worked at the control center, worked with the Germans, we were arm in arm with how we would defend against an attack by Russia or the Czechs or East Germany. And we certainly could watch enough of their aircraft when they, like I say, try to make fake penetrations of the border sort of thing. And that was pleasing to me, Vietnam. And then in Desert Storm, I also worked with the MODA, which is Ministry of Defense and Aviation, which is the regular Saudi army. Those are Arabs. And then the other is the SANG, Saudi Arabian National Guard. Those are Bedouins. Those are the people of the desert, the camels and the sheep you see, wandering, and they wander the deserts, etc. And so I think that's probably the best part of what I did. And then I should add, I have two brothers that both served. My younger brother John was a lieutenant in the military police, was commander of an MP company at Fort Ord, and also worked with the prison and the stockade up there, was involved with a lot of dangerous episodes. These were times of unrest kind of within the Army. And then my other brother Tom served in the Navy as a petty officer, was a supply ship storekeeper kind of thing. Neither of them stayed in, both got out, but we come from a long line of military, and I think we were talking before about what Milwaukee, etc., and it's my grandmother, Maddie, born 1880, daughter of the first lieutenant in the Civil War. And she was always very strong about the background. Really, I think, how do I say, influenced me strongly with the military as far as looking on them, and not only as a career, but as something to serve my country. And she was very poignant about that. And I'm trying to remember the song, Civil War song.
Hymn of the Republic.
Hymn of the Republic, thank you, yes, Hymn of the Republic. She played that all the time on the piano. We'd have a get-together and we'd be playing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, you know. So you were kind of reminded of the Civil War all the time. Anyway, and so she, before she died, made certain that I would have all of the documents from my great-grandfather, which I have on a wall here, of both things, buttons from his uniform, the belt buckle he wore, where his gun belt, where they would have had the powder, etc. on, his commissioning as a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, etc. And so I guess my grandmother, I followed that because of her influence on me and talking about her father, because he was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the veterans organization following the Civil War, the GAR. And, you know, and she just made me appreciate things. And then we have all of his letters he wrote from the battlefields where he was. And then, of course, I think I mentioned my other...
That was your maternal grandmother, correct?
My maternal, right.
And your paternal grandmother influenced you as well.
Right, very much so. Yeah, her name was Amelia. She was part Hispanic and German. She, because of then her father, who was Anton Evans, Anton Evans, he was a sergeant in the same unit as Christian. They didn't know each other at that time, not till well after the war. And she was and in fact, I have an envelope with all of his documents when he was taken a prisoner, where he was wounded, his discharge, and the Confederacy made them take an oath that they wouldn't come back and fight. Well, of course, these guys get healed, they go home, and they turn around and return right away to war. And he was wounded in the Battle of Fredericksburg as Jackson's line turned the Union Army. And the first time he was taken prisoner at Andersonville. The second time, he was a wounded prisoner at the First Baptist Church on Duke Street in Alexandria, Virginia. And my son and I Matthew and I actually visited that church, kind of thing, where he had been a prisoner, kind of thing. You almost could hear voices. But anyway, that kind of covers the military. It's been a good experience, and I'm glad both my sons, I'm glad for Lydia, she would explain her own background as she entered the military and did her 30 years. But I feel like, you know, I've given to the United States. And I think I might add, as an adjunct to all of this, and maybe it's the military, I think, that prepared me for this, since I was involved with refugee camps in Vietnam, and even partially in Desert Storm, because we had so many of the Kuwaitis were in refugee camps in Saudi Arabia. They had fled Iraq. And that's that I'm a volunteer with the American Red Cross. Actually joined when I was 17 years old, 60 years ago. My grandmother, Maddie, who was a pharmacist, and my mother, a microbiologist, had served as Red Cross ladies doing the bandaging. In those days, we didn't have all this fancy modern machines. They did bandage folding. And I remember my grandmother saying, "You're going to join the Red Cross." Yes, I will. Anyway, and as a result, I've worked running shelters all over the United States, and I ran the largest shelter in Katrina with 7,000 people, briefed President Clinton, briefed cabinet members, briefed Dad Bush, because he and Bill Clinton were good buddies with the Katrina, and briefed everybody from the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, etc. And we got through that episode. I feel I'm a pretty strong person, and I watched that from my personnel. We had none of the Red Cross volunteers, and I had over 1,500 during the 40 days I ran that shelter. Not a one of them was hurt, and we lost nobody that was a refugee or one of our clients kind of stuff. Even if they were sick, we had medical attention there, because the hospitals were jammed, so we did our own hospital right in the shelter. So I think the Army has contributed to how I see things and how I work with people. I've run homeless shelters for Salvation Army at one time for a couple of years, and so I think the Army has made me who I am, and I'm glad of it. So.
Good. So you've had some interesting positions since you left the military.
Right.
You want to tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I think one being the volunteer one with the Red Cross, and whether it was hurricanes in Florida or fires in Colorado or Wyoming or New Mexico, etc. Katrina then, and in fact, as you and I were talking, Camarillo Springs ran the shelter up there when all the mud came down, and I was reminded how devastating it was. I can remember it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and this elderly couple came in with their housekeeper, and they were just coated with mud, and because it blown through the house, etc. And I remember our nurses taking them we were at Leisure World, and they took them into the showers, cleaned them up, and wrapped them in blankets, etc. And I was thinking, it's like a continuation of war, disasters are wars. It's Mother Nature against us, not a personal enemy, but kind of thing. And then Red Cross, a lot of episodes. Lydia and I have taken part with fires, like out in Santa Paula, where you'll have a whole bunch of people and you have to take care of them. And then the job I had with the Salvation Army, I went to work for them. And in fact, it was kind of funny. My son Matt was at college, etc., and Lydia and I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, let me just see if there's anything out there that I would like to do," and happened to apply for this job to run programs for the Salvation Army social services. And part of it was housing, part of it was going to be winter warming shelters for homeless. And I walk into this office with the captain, Norm Patton, who commanded the church. And he points his finger at me and said, "God sent you." And I went, "Okay, I think he did. I'm not sure." Anyway, and so I continued to do those kinds of things. And this is a funny, what would I say, both incident and kind of a reminder of who I am. The Salvation Army said, "My God, this guy's an Army colonel. He's probably a jerk. He'll treat the homeless bad and all the rest of this stuff." And Patton said, no, he's not that kind of guy. We checked on him, etc. So I went down for an interview at the division headquarters in Los Angeles, and the guy that interviewed me was the son, he's British, he's a psychiatrist, he's the son of a British command sergeant major, "Yes, sir." And the father had worked at Sandhurst, which is the academy for the British Army. And he immediately makes it clear that they just want to be sure that I'm a nice guy. And I came through his interviews with flying colors, that they thought I'd be okay in doing it, because they worry about that. I mean, if somebody's not nice to the clients, can you imagine the uproar that people cause? And so forth. So I found that to be fascinating, that they were fearful of my military career, but then they said, "Oh, God, no, you've worked with people all the time." I said, "Yeah." So anyway, I've had other jobs. In the meantime, not only have I taught, part-time, I taught for the college for 34 years, hundreds of classes, and, a couple thousand students, I'm sure, in business. And I've worked for county government, etc., as well, just in other jobs. Like I ran a job training program at one time for 5 years. I've worked for the county with the sanitation district, etc., but that was recycling programs. Again, working with people to get them to recycle. But anyway, so I've been busy most of my life, so, and I like it.
Didn't you also serve at the Ventura County or City of Ventura Police Department?
Yes, actually I was a reserve police officer with Ventura in the 80s till 90, fall of 90 when I went back on active duty, but I was a police officer with Ventura actually, and I was with Vern Alstad. I have a picture of it, Vern Alstad and his canine, who was the first canine killed by a kidnapper in, I think it was like 84, 85 kind of thing. But yeah, no, I worked as a police, and it was kind of, that's again a very amusing, or maybe it's telling, because the guys always used to say, Mike's so nice with all the people, even the bad guys. And I said, well, I'd rather be nice with them than sit there and fight them. You know, I said, I think it's easier for me to talk somebody into giving up than sit there and have to fight them. And they used to, and then I was also, because in the Red Cross, I also was a professional CPR, first aid instructor, etc. So I recertified the whole PD. And they were so funny, they'd call, is Mike on duty today? Get him over here. We need CPR. And I thought, oh, okay, whatever. So, yes.
Just to backtrack a little bit, your grandmother Amelia, I believe, gave you a book that influenced your young adult life?
Yes, she did. My hero has been Teddy Roosevelt. And she gave me a book. It's a first edition of Teddy Roosevelt's African Game Trails. He went to hunt in Africa when he finished his presidency. And then I became more intrigued by Teddy Roosevelt's influence on America, and then what his various, what would I call them, occupations and interests were. And so I followed him. Military, you know, San Juan Hill, the Spanish-American War. Police, he was the commissioner of the police in New York, kind of stuff, and so I became a police officer. And actually, I even beat that out a bit. In the very early 60s, before I went on active duty, I was a National Park Ranger law enforcement in Grand Teton National Park in northwestern Wyoming, in a time when it was a very bad time, a dangerous time, with the Park Service had not become as sophisticated as they are now with law enforcement, and so it was a kind of an interesting time dealing with yahoos who were not very nice. A cowboy and rancher, which Teddy was, but my wife and I own a ranch in northern New Mexico near where her folks grew up and where she grew up, and in fact we own the ranch on part of the original land grant that she had, one of her relatives had owned, given by the king, the Vigils. And so we have elk on the property, and so we have a ranch. We do bed and breakfast, or we did until I became ill with cancer. And then education, well, Park Service, and then I had served as a park ranger, as I said, and because Teddy is responsible for a lot of the parks, it very pushed really the Park Service, because it was its 75th anniversary and now 100th anniversary now. And then teaching, and I think what I emulated was not so much that he was a teacher or a professor, but that he tried to teach the United States, you know, about their duties, much like John Kennedy did, who, by the way, was the first president I ever voted for. But, and I think I managed to, what would I say, capture all of the images and what would I say, paths that Teddy went down, and I think I followed him through all those. So anyway, so he was my hero too.
It's a good hero to have. Can you give me a little bit of information about the positive and negative effects of your military experience on your later life or your personal life?
Well, yeah, positive. I think it made me the person that I am, that I feel both leadership, management, dealing with people, because the military is such a mixing bowl, you know, not only ethnicity, you know, black, Hispanic, Asian, you know, Anglos, but it's also people with different backgrounds. I mean, how much education, you know, they had, how well do they take to being given orders, or how do you even give orders or direction to somebody? And I think the Army really helped me with that tremendously, and I know my sons have always commented that they saw that in me, that and even the police stuff, that I wasn't some sort of a harsh, dictatorial kind of guy. I tried to work with people to get them to do stuff and didn't. So I think that was a good part. I think difficult, I guess, that I was lucky enough that although war is a bad place, and I certainly saw enough killing and dead bodies and all the rest of that stuff, and knelt alongside of GIs and cried when they were dying. But I didn't, what do I say, come back and get all, I wasn't screwed up, but I think that's because of my background. I had kind of been building towards this kind of thing, you know, and I was fortunate enough to have had both my strong grandmother, my strong mother. My father was involved in my life, but he was always so busy, so it was really the two ladies that raised me and their ideas of what is right and wrong and that kind. And my brothers were raised also by my grandma and my mother. And yeah, I think the tragedy kind of was my first marriage went down the tubes because I didn't realize that Gail was an only child, and as a result, she, what would I say, closer to her parents and didn't like being in the military, was upset when we were in Germany and she was too far away from them, and then when I went to Vietnam, etc., and I wanted to stay on active duty, as it was. I mean, I got like 12 years service of active every time I went back on active duty. But, finally, I forget when it was, 87, 88, something like that. No, I mean, I'm sorry, 70s, 75. She finally decided that she really didn't want to be part of the Army, etc., or me even being gone with reserve duty back to Fort Bragg for 3 weeks and that kind of stuff. So she left, and then I remarried thinking that the gal I married, Edith, Matt's mother, was in the Army, but then she decided that she had other things and I wasn't a part of where she was going, and so she left. And so I was fortunate enough to meet Lydia in the unit, and in fact we were together. Her husband passed away in '87 when we were back at Fort Leavenworth, and anyway, she and I hit it off because she knew I wasn't a bad guy, and that because she'd seen me in operation in the unit. She was the adjutant, I was the commandant, etc. So, but yeah, and then she and I have been together, you know, through one war, Desert Storm together, up at 5 in the morning, get to the Pentagon for briefings and all that horrible stuff, get on the metro, grab a cup of coffee and run, you know, and the two of us lived through all of that kind of pain and anguish, and and we owned the ranch together, and so forth. So anyway, yeah, no matter what you do in this world, things have an influence, good and evil, and you know, people's relationships change. People see different things, you know, and so they say, I don't want to be a part of that, or you know, whatever. And so, you know, I just march on, and you know, we've done our thing.
Didn't you have some negative health effects from your exposure in Vietnam?
Oh yeah, in January or February of 1967, I was in a light observation helicopter coming into a valley. We were dropping in, I was replacing the operations officer in a battalion down below. And unfortunately, the light observation helicopters have no doors, they're wide open. And unfortunately, we flew under a Operation Ranch Hand C-130, which was spraying Agent Orange. And this stuff came into the aircraft. Of course, Agent Orange is responsible for the VA stuff with all kinds of cancers, and in 2013 ended up discovering stage 4 cancer, bladder, prostate, all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I have a gift from the military operations kind of stuff, but I'm still alive, and I could have died.
You're healthy now.
Yeah, I'm healthy now, and just had my last CT scan, and everything looks good. So.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
What message would you like to leave for future generations who will view and hear this interview?
I would say, be like John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, what can you do for your country? And I think today there are so few people that serve, voluntarily. And the other part that troubles me terribly is the physical abilities of them. There's so much obesity, so much negativity on the young people, and you read that when you talk to the armed services, people are recruiting, people can't pass the tests, et cetera, and some people are so distant, kind of thing. They're not aware of what's necessary. That today there's, so few people get in the military. So what I guess I'm saying is be willing to step forward and serve, whether it's the military, Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, wherever it happens to be. Do something for your country rather than have them have to do something for you, kind of thing. Give me my free education, give me this, give me... Nah, man, you got to get out there and step forward and do things. I mean, I went through school college by working, and then ended up with an ROTC scholarship, etc. And my sons, have all done, both the military, paying for stuff, the ROTC scholarships, etc. So, yeah, that's what I would leave. Please do something for your country, and that's really what message I would leave.
And do you feel that your military experience, that your country gave back as much to you as you gave to your country?
Oh, yeah. Formed me. I was a piece of clay, out of high school and then into college, and that's when the formation of the military started molding me into who I was as far as how I perceived things, how I thought about things, how I did... and I think what's important is to learn how to work with people as a team, not as the dictator of them, but as a team member, so that you're coordinating everybody's activities. And I think that was, of all the things, and my youngest son particularly, who's the Army major at Bragg, has made that comment a couple of times to me. He said, I'm so glad for the direction that you put me in. He said, so that I know how to work with people. My sons were Eagle Scouts, and Matt had a huge project spread across the mountains up here for his Eagle project, and he had to work with all these scouts. And he said, I've applied it whether it was in Iraq, or now at Fort Bragg. So, and well, Germany, he just spent 3 years at Landstuhl, the Army hospital there. Saw all the wounded coming from Iraq and Afghanistan and every other bad place where people get hurt. So anyway, yeah, yes, very much so.
And you're expecting your first grandchild soon.
Yes, we're waiting for a call from Fort Bragg. Could be today, could be tomorrow. She's due tomorrow, but she was getting closer and closer, so we're waiting for that first grandchild. So.
That's Yvette.
Yvette, right? Yeah, She's a doctor of physical therapy, and she's actually, you talk about military, she's La Cubana. Her mother escaped from Fidel Castro's Cuba. So we're a composite family here, so anyway.
Do you think there's anything that we haven't discussed in this interview that you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered everything. I'm just proud of what I've done. I'm proud of what my family's done, kind of thing. So, no, I'm comfortable with everything that's been said, so thank you.
And rightfully so. Thank you.
Thank you.